Introduce and hand over to Gina Vale. Gina is a research fellow at the International Center for the Study of Radicalization and an associate fellow at MNC Saatchi World Services, specializing in gender-sensitive analysis of terrorism and extremist violence. Her doctoral research examined the impact of Islamic State's governance and state-building activities on local Muslim and Yazidi women in Iraq and Syria. She has academic and professional experience in Europe, the Middle East, and Sub-Saharan Africa, and has conducted extensive field work in internally displaced person camps in northern Iraq and Iraqi Kurdistan. She studies and consults on issues such as women's and minors de-radicalization, female and minor-focused propaganda, and the roles of female and underage extremists and combatants. Her research has been published in Studies on Conflicts of Terrorism, Small Wars and Insurgencies, CTC Sentinel, and Conflict, Security and Development, among others. She completed her PhD in War Studies at the King's College in London and holds an MA in Terrorism, Security and Society with distinction from the King's College in London and a BA Honours in Asian and Middle Eastern Studies from the University of Cambridge. Gina, wonderful to have you with us today, and I'm very much looking forward to your presentation. The screen is all yours.
Thank you very much for that extremely detailed introduction of mine, going back many years now. Thank you very much for having me. I want to really stress that we are trying to now build into the debates around foreign terrorist fighters and gender and extremism some focus on minors, because one of the most important aspects of dealing with gender and terrorism is that we're not just dealing with, first of all, women, secondly, adults. So we really want to start broadening these debates, trying to understand the dynamics both within terrorist groups themselves, how gender is manipulated within terrorism, but also how it's still feeding into and having ramifications in counterterrorism practice. So first of all, a bit of framing, a bit of background. In 2018, myself and my former colleague, Dr. Joanna Cook, put together the first global data set, drilling down and disaggregating data on men, women, and minors who had joined Islamic State from over 80 countries worldwide. In 2019, we updated that data set with the latest figures available from open and government sources and found that up to 6,577 minors had either traveled to with their parents alone or had been born into IS territory in Iraq and Syria. That constitutes for up to 15% of all individuals that became affiliated with Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Where we were able to get disaggregated data was really between adult men and women, but there was hardly any disaggregated data for minors. Tajikistan was the only exception. We are still very much in the dark as to how many children, boys and girls respectively, joined IS or became affiliated with the group. It's worth also mentioning that these figures do not include the thousands of young children who became indoctrinated and brought into the terrorist group's ranks among the local population, as well as many hundreds and thousands who also were captured and forcibly conscripted into the group. We're still very much in the dark and the data is not there at the moment. But what can we say about gender and how it feeds into Islamic State? The group took up what is called a traditionalist stance with regard to gender and particularly women, but this also feeds into the expectations for men and boys within the group. The expectations were that the roles afforded to men and boys and women and girls were binarized. Those expectations for men and boys would often center around aggression, military prowess, dominance, no fear, also mercilessness in some cases. The equal and opposite was expected for women and girls. You would see that women were expected to be financially dependent on men, also practically dependent to be able to move within IS's territory. And there would be a sense of vulnerability that goes together with that dependency. Throughout IS's propaganda and narrative, the expectation was that men and boys were fighting for not only the state, but what they saw as feminized dependence, these women and girls who were dependent on them on the front lines, but also on the day-to-day running of IS's state building project. This then goes into how IS delineated its roles within its organization. And we've now started to see greater studies focused on how women have been engaged in the group. And of course, men as often the face and the supposed muscle of the group is well known. Lesser known is the roles that minors have undertaken. And whereas we have seen cases of forced conscription of particularly young boys, it's very difficult to work out what minors have done within the extremist territory, because we don't have their social media posts, for example. It's very limited, the online activity that was documented for minors within the territory, unless they became adults throughout their period of engagement with the group. But what we do see is these masculine militarized roles are passed down to young boys at a very, very early age. Indeed, this involves families as well, trying to frame that upbringing for young boys as being something natural, but also something to aspire to and compete for. And so when we talk about young boys within IS, we often talk about the cubs of the caliphate being the general term that young boys were referred to as, but that's not actually the case. The cubs of the caliphate were really an elite subset of IS's boy-child population. These would be the boys that would be conscripted into IS's training camps, undergo physical and ideological training, and then be deployed in a plethora of roles, whether that was as executioners in some cases, as spies, as frontline combatants, as weapon handlers, or assisting in construction or operations or couriering of weapons. The idea is that this would be from a very early age, and pamphlets were circulated to encourage women to aid in the indoctrination of young boys. One particularly salient pamphlet was called A Sister's Role in Jihad. Now, supposedly this was written by a foreign woman who had joined the group, but it encouraged physical training, so swimming, archery to help with target practice, running practice for stamina, as well as reading stories of mujahideen that had attained martyrdom, that glory that had been bestowed upon them. And the idea was that young boys would compete within each other to try and attain not only the cub of the caliphate credentials by joining this elite militarized subforce, but then also the glory that would be bestowed upon them if they were martyred in the conflict. And this certainly did happen. There were some young boys that were actually mentioned as martyrs within the group's propaganda. So some of them did attain that celebratory prowess that they were searching for. But then now we look at the collapse of the caliphate post-2019, when IS lost its final enclave Baghouz in northeastern Syria. And certainly this is the first point at which you could say that counter-extremism has come face to face with actually young boys that were involved in the group. And the policies that have been enacted on how these individuals have been managed, treated, organized, and that await their fate is quite telling. If you look at the populations of camps in northeastern Syria, the vast majority are of women and young children. They call in young children, but really what we're talking about is young girls. Only young boys up until approximately the age of 10 are living in these camps. Beyond that age, adolescent and preteen boys are actually being transferred and held in prisons in northeastern Syria. The conditions of these prisons are abhorrent. They are being kept in very large, crowded, unsanitary cells, very little room for some of them to even sit down in. There is no charges being leveled against the majority of the prison population, and it's very difficult to know if they will ever face charges in the near future. There is no prospects of their release thus far, and it appears that there is at the moment a conveyor belt of adolescents once they reach in their early teenage years to be transferred from camps into prisons. It's a unidirectional flow. And at the moment, these prisons are becoming more and more overcrowded. Why is this? Why are these boys there and they're not with their mothers in camps in northeastern Syria? It's not necessarily that camps are any better. They are also unsanitary conditions. They've been termed as a humanitarian crisis over the last few years, and we've seen high infant mortality rates. So it's certainly no rosy alternative, but it's very different in the way that these two populations are being treated, and particularly how they are securitized. When we're dealing with minors, there is this idea that they are innocent, potentially until radicalized. We've seen in headlines of not only young girls, but also young boys who were supposedly groomed or lured to joining IS. The headlines have since turned. Now we're hearing of young minors being called a ticking time bomb. They're dealt with as securitized threats first and foremost, rather than actually the victims of their adult caregivers. The majority of the individuals that now are being held in prison camps, in prisons and camps, have traveled to IS in the company of an adult parent or caregiver. In that case, we need to understand that their agency or their choice in order to travel was very limited. Yet they are still being treated as security threats rather than as the victims of the crimes of their parents or caregivers to take them and effectively traffic them into Syria. When we're talking about questions of repatriation, and this is something that Sofia is going to speak about, we speak very little of adolescent boys. The vast majority of repatriation efforts have come from the camps in northeastern Syria. When we're counting women and minors who have been able to return back, these are camp populations that have gone through national repatriation programs rather than releases from prisons. Adolescent boys are not being counted within this. This is why, going back to my first point, we need gender disaggregated data for minors as well as for adults. How can we know how many young boys are still staying in these prisons if we don't know the proportion of boys versus girls in the first wave of joining IS in the first place? As I say, we're still in a little bit in the dark. But when we think about how gendered ideals are rigid, these ideals of masculine and military prowess that were celebrated under IS, we can now also see how they are fluid in their implementation. So whilst under the group, certainly they would be expected to undertake very masculine militarized roles. But now, in the case where there are many detained in these prisons, we're now starting to see narratives change. If you look at the recent prison break in al-Sin'a prison in the Ghairan section, there are about 700 boys from approximately the age of 10 who were involved in this prison break by being used as human shields by IS militants. Whereas once upon a time, these young boys would sometimes be featured in execution videos. They would be the ones holding the weapons. They would be the strong future generation of IS, almost going into manhood prematurely. Now we're seeing their boyhood being used against them. If we look at how counterterrorism practices are engaging with these young boys, on the one hand, we're seeing them as a threat, and on the other hand, we're reminded by IS themselves that they are actually still boys. So which is it, and how do we negotiate this? If we fail to see the cycle go through, if we fail to see that some of the same grievances that first fueled the indoctrination, radicalization, and then recruitment of these young boys is now being fueled up again in their indefinite detention, in the plight of their mothers and sisters within camps that are also being indefinitely detained, then we risk this cycle continuing. It's these grievances and these narratives that IS is continuing to tap into, even as it is lacking or reducing its capacity for its propaganda outputs. So what I would say is at all stages, we not only need data to fill this gap, but we need to start considering how themes of masculinity are being used throughout the radicalization process in a cyclical fashion. It's not just a one unitary stage that we're going through. Thank you.
Gina, thank you so much for this. A great kickoff. I really appreciate this. I have not seen any questions yet, so please don't be shy. Use the Q&A while the presentations are going on so that we have a seamless transition between the Q&A, between the presentations and the Q&A session. But now it's, of course, a particular pleasure for me to introduce Ms. Koller. For those of you who are regularly attending CEP webinars, you will have heard from Sofia before, but today is the first time that she presents her work in her new role as a senior research analyst for CEP, working in our Berlin office. And actually, she's sitting in the office as we speak. In addition to her work for CEP, she's also supporting the work of the Radicalization Awareness Network, RAN, of the European Commission, and works as an expert for the Council of Europe. Before joining CEP, Ms. Koller worked between 2018 and 21 as a research fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP. At DGAP, her work focused on issues related to counterterrorism and the prevention of violent extremism. She was also the project leader of the International Forum for Expert Exchange on Countering Islamist Extremism, InfoX. Before joining DGAP, Sofia was a consultant for different initiatives and organizations in France and Lebanon. She studied international relations and management at the University of Applied Sciences Regensburg and at the German Jordanian University in Amman, as well as international conflict studies at the War Studies Department at King's College London. In her master thesis, Sofia analyzed parliamentary debates on the state of emergency and counterterrorism measures after the November 2015 attacks in France. Sofia, wonderful, and thanks for putting up this webinar today, and welcome to your first CEP webinar. I'm, as always, very much looking forward to your presentation, and the screen is all yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Hans, and also Gina for presenting once wonderful and new insight into this debate. And it was really our objective to not speak again why repatriation is necessary, what are the pros and cons and so on, but to really bring in some new reflections into this debate, which I think is really important. So, of course, what Gina already laid out very, very well is that it's really important to speak not only about the broad population or men, women, and children, but really look further into gender and age dimension in all these categories. And of course, the approach to this population is part of a broader challenge, not only how they're approached in Northeastern Syria or also in Iraq, but also how Western governments are approaching this question of their nationals or persons that have affiliation with their countries. So as I said, much has been said and written about these issues already, so I will not go into the debate on repatriation again, but I will do bring in some new insights and developments in the recent time. So first about the repatriation issue. Of course, we assume that repatriation would be, the right response to this challenge to manage security risk, prevent further violation of human rights, and also fulfill legal obligations. But still, we see that the majority of governments who have nationals in the camps and in the prisons are rejecting this, the repatriation of their nationals. But of course, as we have seen in the past years, there has been positions that have been adopted, either a voluntary policy change or forced by national courts, meaning that alone in 2021, almost 100 women and children have been repatriated from the camps. And two countries with the highest amount of IS affiliates and also nationals still in the camp are Germany and France. So I think it's a good idea to look into these two countries, how they have approached repatriations under this question of gender counterterrorism approaches. So Germany has had 4 repatriations since 2019. And while at first it was only minors that have been repatriated and only 1 adult, there have been more and more efforts to also bring back adult women, in total 12 adult women. And what is very interesting here is, Gina was talking about the lack of data, is that the first time past year in December 2021, in response to a parliamentary inquiry, the German government provided for the first time a breakdown not only in age, but also in gender. So it was explicitly demanded to have a better understanding of what was the population of this repatriation efforts. And so we know that there were mostly girls, so minor girls who were brought back, 23 younger than 6, 18 younger than 12, and one boy, younger than 17. So I think this is really an important step in bringing more nuance and more data into this debate. But it confirms what Gina has said, that repatriation, if happening, is mostly about girls. And these repatriation have been carried out under a lot of secrecy. They were only revealed once the women and children were already traveling or had arrived. And there was not really a scandal or like a strong public reaction to this repatriation, which I found interesting. Another fact that is interesting is that the argumentation by Germany is that the children were brought back because of humanitarian needs or because of court orders obliging the German governments to bring them back. And this brings us back to the question of gender approaches. The women that were brought back in their function as mothers. And this is interesting because other countries have opted to not bring children back with their mothers. And interestingly, at least 2 of the women that were brought back were already considered as Gefährder, which means in German that the security agencies in Germany believe that these women could commit heavy crimes at any moment. So the question is, so despite them being considered dangerous, they were brought back. So how is I think this deserves more analysis to look into why some countries bring back mothers or not, and how is the decision-making process behind that? Because on the other hand, France has repatriated 35 children since 2019, but not with their mothers. So they have even left a French woman to die in the camps. And while there is a lot of public debate, especially now in the elections coming up in April 2020, on security, terrorism, preventing Islamist extremism, and so on, the position has not changed. So even against the repatriation of children, there's a lot of public backlash, which means that there were further repatriation plans, but after a opinion poll became public, these plans were then deleted because, again, this question of repatriation is less of a humanitarian or security dimension, but more of a political decision. 2 decisions in the recent time that concern France are also interesting in this regard. The first one is that there was a decision of the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child last week, actually. And they said that France's refusal to repatriate French children from the Syrian camps violates their right to life, as well as their right to be free from inhuman and degrading treatment. And this is, of course, not a binding decision, but it is a strong urge for France to finally repatriate the remainder of their children. There's a really a strong group of relatives and also advocates for the repatriation that is active in France. And they have brought the case of repatriation before the European Court of Human Rights. This is the second news that I wanted to share. And there are these 2 French families who demand repatriation of their daughters and grandchildren from the camps. And while, of course, the European Court of Human Rights has not pronounced any decision yet, so the process is ongoing, once they will decide for or against repatriation, this will, in my opinion, really be a landmark decision, because it means that if the European Court of Human Rights decides that France holds jurisdiction over the northeast of Syria and has an obligation to bring back its citizens, this will also have important implications for other European countries. However, the process before the court is for women and minors, so it does not yet touch upon the question of male foreign fighters. So it will be interesting to see if then the decision would also implicate the repatriation of male foreign fighters, or it would be really only for obligating the repatriation of women and their children. Because the question of male foreign fighters is hugely unpopular, there's not really a debate on whether they can be brought back. It seems quite natural to leave them there, despite there being many reports from national and international counterterrorism bodies who show that the terrorist and security risk that result from this detention in the camps and prisons in Syria and Iraq is actually greater than the risk that might arise from their repatriation. Having talked about repatriation, let's go into the prosecution aspect of this, because the assumption, of course, would be that Western government want to hold foreign fighters accountable, they want to provide justice to the victims, but also the repatriation and then the prosecution would be an important condition to also enable rehabilitation in prison and also social reintegration, disengagement and de-radicalization efforts further on. So the other assumption is that if countries of origin were more confident that they can hold actually the nationals accountable and start this rehabilitation, disengagement process, this might also be a strong argument for repatriation. Coming back to the whole gendered approach. So in prosecution also there have been these gender stereotypes for lots of years that women played only a limited supporting role in terrorist organizations such as IS. They were harmless overall, they were naive and lured and so on. But on the other hand, there was also an uncertainty of how women or female that played a role in terrorist organizations can be charged and convicted. And this would also influence how countries then decide to prosecute female returnees. And as Gina said, this is really also thanks to the amazing work that she has done with her colleague Joanna on providing more insight onto the various roles that women have played with IS to change this perception and enable also a more nuanced view. So this is also then the consequence that criminal justice practitioners and decision makers in the last years have developed a better understanding or a more accurate understanding of women's roles and have also adapted their prosecution approaches accordingly. Because from a legal perspective, of course, the prosecution should not be different between male and female returnees or in general. But of course, and this is something that they have also accepted, is that the prosecution then is still more challenging. Overall, the prosecution is challenging because there is a lack of evidence that can be used in Western courts. But, and this is also something that Gina mentioned, because women had less public appearances, had less activity on social media, there are different factors that make the collection and handling of evidence for women much more challenging. And this is in addition to still a lack of understanding of the activities that they would have apart from a purely domestic role. And what I found interesting also is that when I started to look into this issue, it became clear that I have a broad understanding, or there are reports on prosecution approaches and so on, but there's also, again, a lack of real data. So how many female returnees have been charged? How many have been convicted? How long were the sentences? And that's why I looked into the press releases of the German Federal Court of Justice and other bodies in Germany, together with Alexander Schiele. We've recently published a report in the CTC Sentinel on this issue, so the prosecution in Germany of female returnees, to really provide a first analysis of how many people are we talking about. What we found is that the systematic prosecution of female returnees really started only in 2018, when the German Federal Court of Justice ruled that for women, the presence in Islamic State territory is not enough to constitute a membership in terrorist organization. This means that German prosecutors had to find other ways to prove that they had other activities within Islamic State that would then support the claim that they were actually members or supporters of this terrorist organization. So what we found is that of the more than 80 German female returnees, 20 have been convicted so far, and 19 for the membership of support of foreign terrorist organizations, so almost all of them who have been convicted also for this, and other Other convictions include violations of the War Weapons Control Act, War Crimes Act, such as pillaging and looting, crimes against humanity, war crimes against people, but also, of course, for taking children to a war zone. And just to mention a very brief example to illustrate one of the cases is Jennifer W., who was sentenced in October 2021 for 10 years in prison for membership in a foreign terrorist organization, aiding and abetting murder by omission, and crimes against humanity with fatal consequences. Because she joined Islamic State in summer 2014, and she did nothing to prevent the death of a Yazidi slave girl, who her husband, an ISIS fighter, hanged on a fence as punishment. And this is just one example of the several crimes that these women committed, purely next to a domestic role that would be taking care of children or cooking for their husband. So they are far from naive and lured and not having any activity in these crimes that have been committed. We also found the average sentence for female returnees currently stands at 3 years and 10 months. So the 10-year prison sentence that Jennifer W. received is really something rather extraordinary. When we look at France, France started prosecuting female returnees much early on. Between 2015-16, they started. And this was also because there's a much stronger perception of the danger or the potential danger of female returnees, because there was a thwarted attack carried out by several women that were not, led by a male counterpart somewhere, but were acting on their own. So there's a different perception of the agency that women and also, of course, female returnees can have. In France, women are usually charged with apology for terrorism, that's a term, criminal association, but also child endangerment and war crimes. And so far in January 2022, of the 110 female returnees, as always, numbers, it's a bit difficult to be precise here, 39 female returnees were incarcerated in France. In France, sentences are a bit higher, 6 years and 8 months in prison. And this is also because France has a tougher counterterrorism law than Germany, for example. But still, they have the lesser offenses than male returnees. So what does this mean? First, when we talk about repatriation, we clearly see that there's difference in approach, not only because of age, but also of gender. So if anybody is repatriated, that would be minors, but here again, there are a lot of challenges. Then women who are repatriated, mostly in their function as mothers. So is that like a gendered approach as well? And still there's a very strong stance against the repatriation of men. Now there are talks about, again, international tribunal or having outsourced the prosecution to the Kurdish territory or Iraq. And the second insight is that clearly women or female returnees are taken more seriously in their shared responsibility for the crimes committed as part of ISIS. And thanks to this more nuanced, more accurate understanding of their roles, they're also held accountable. And of course, I can only subscribe to what Gina has said. We need more data on that are gender sensitive and age sensitive to really be able to analyze the responses of states. And what I would add to that is really that in terms of hold not only women but also men accountable, we need more cooperation and exchange of the evidence that we need. For example, recently Sweden and France set up a joint investigation team to target crimes against Yazidi victims with the help of Eurojust. And then, of course, there's also the United Nations investigative team to promote accountability for crimes committed by Daesh, ISIL, UNITAD. So these are two mechanisms that enable the use of or improve the use of battlefield evidence and to bring more of returnees to justice. And then the second part that I also would like to highlight is that there are a lot of open questions also regarding rehabilitation and reintegration of women. There's less experience of prison staff with radicalized women in prison. And also, and I think this is also a really important point, that there is still a lack of gender sensitive risk assessment tools, because they were developed, of course, with a population of men. And now this understanding has slowly changed, and we need to update our tools to be more gender, but also to be more age sensitive. So let's leave it there. Thank you, and looking forward to your questions.
Fantastic. So we already have one question. I'm sure we're going to get a couple more now that we have time to discuss. I want to combine the question from the participants with the question that I have. The question is about the educations that minors receive in camps and prisons, and I think I know the answer, and it's not a good one. And the lack of data, Gina, that you highlighted. I mean, what is the impediment to the data collection here? Is it lack of capacity in the camps with the SDF? Is it lack of interest or political will to get this data? It shouldn't be that difficult to get more disaggregated data according to gender and age. But why is it not forthcoming?
Okay, great. So I'll kick off with the question about education. In prisons, zero, very gloomy, zero education whatsoever. In camps, it's a slightly different picture. So from very early on, when Baghouz was first liberated, there was the large influx of populations into Al-Hol and Raj camps. That was around March, April 2019. By June of that year, UNICEF had set up 5 learning centres, and they were catering for about 5,500 school-aged children. Whilst that's certainly a decent number, at that time there were 23,000 school-aged children in the camps. So it was a still very, very small population or subset of the population. This did eventually expand, however, then COVID hit. So up until that point, those learning centres were only catering for a small number of students. There were various reasons for this. One, sheer space within these camps, because they were, even from the very outset of when Baghouz was liberated, very overcrowded and overpopulated. Actually having space for these learning centres was very difficult. The second was multilingualism of these students. If you think about, particularly in the annex part of Al-Hol, there are no learning centres still to this day. The reason being, or one of the reasons, is because of the multilingualism of the student. But the third reason is because of the rejection of secular education that is offered by UNICEF by the mothers or female caregivers that are caring for or acting as the legal guardians for these children. At that point, we started to see, particularly on Telegram, but also even on platforms such as Instagram, women exchanging tips on how to homeschool their children in the camp setting. When COVID hit, this was exacerbated. All UNICEF learning centres were closed. There was a large lockdown. And so if you think about how women adopted an educational and indoctrinational and radicalizing role for the next generation in the private sphere within IS's territory, that was then pretty much just geographically moved under lockdown in these camps, because that private sphere became the tent setting. And so women once again reverted back to their role of indoctrinating children. And we saw some of the consequences of this when we see young children that have produced IS paraphernalia and flags and makeshift guns out of piping or drain pipe within the camp. So that's on the issue of schooling. It's not a particularly rosy picture, as you have expected. On the second issue of around data, firstly, I think it's because women and children being involved in terrorism is still surprising, even now, even though the first female documented terrorist being convicted was in 1881. We're still to this day shocked that women are involved, and certainly when it comes to children, that's an even step further that they would be involved in terrorism. But if you look across both right-wing extremism and Islamist extremism, you can see under 18s engaging organically, whether that's purely online or whether that's without the company of a parental guardian to travel into a conflict zone, as well as being indoctrinated through that family unit. So I think, unfortunately, the first issue as to why we don't have much gender disaggregated data of those that traveled is because it's still quite shocking. It's still a blind spot for counterterrorism professionals. Now on the other end, on the reverse end, now looking at these camps, unfortunately, we're faced with counterterrorism in practice and the uncertainties around the detention and situation that these women and children are in. We have a slightly better idea within prisons where data is being released, and often it isn't, but because it's an all-male population, if we get an idea of minors, they will be boy children. In the camps, it's a little bit harder, because when women were registered into these camps, often they did not give much identifying information, because they did not want to be identified for the hope that they would be able to return back to their countries of origin. So unfortunately, there's ways in which this is playing out, that we had a blind spot to start with through shock factor, and now we have another blind spot through the expectation of what awaits these individuals when and if they return.
Super, thank you so much. I really appreciate this. And Sofia, there's also a question for you, which I'm again going to combine with a question from my side. First, a small information. Untitled, of course, is now becoming very famous, especially in Germany, because it's led by a German former prosecutor. But the Security Council also has set up a mechanism for Syria called IIIM, International Impartial Independent Mechanism for Syria, headquartered in Geneva, led by the former ombudsperson of the al-Qaeda regime, who has decades of experience in actually collecting evidence. And that brings me to my question here. It is really strange that we still feel that there is at least I got it from your presentation, a nervousness, a hesitation, a insecurity about potentially achieving prosecutions when Germany and France have actually shown that if you take a little bit of fantasy and make an effort, you can actually achieve prosecutions. Maybe not the prosecutions that you would like to have, but some prosecutions which then allows you to start a controlled de-radicalization, disengagement, and reintegration process. So where is the problem? Years after it's been first set, right? The first mentioning of taking care of returnees was 2014 in the Security Council. Why are we still wondering how we're going to be able to prosecute these people when we have mechanisms to collect evidence on the ground in a prosecutable manner? We have made big strides in battlefield evidence, in e-evidence, and still there seems to be this hesitation. What is the reason? And that combines with the question, how can we change the attitude of countries thinking of these young people as terrorists to vulnerable trafficked children? So basically just change the perception of what these minors are.
Yeah, very, very interesting question. So maybe let me start with the last one. So I think this really goes back to the data question. Because if you think about it, at first, the discussion of foreign fighters was mainly about like hordes of foreign fighters going into Syria and Iraq, and then slowly with more data coming in or more research, like really looking, so well, who is going and why are they going? Slowly there was this realization, okay, it's not only men, it's only women. How many women? Why? Which women? Then they were taking minors. So like from more and more information coming in on the profiles and the motivations of these people, came more understanding of the roles and possible threats, but also chances, let's say. And then now we're at this point where we're saying, okay, finally we're having more data where even governments are providing information not only on foreign fighters in general, but having gender aggregated data, which makes it also important to just think about responses, because while we agree that in some cases it should be the same response, never mind the gender, in some cases, yes, because of different roles that IS has adopted for men and women, we also have to find different responses to them. So I think that's one aspect. And then now we're coming closer to the period, and that's why I cited this response of the German government, that the parliament specifically asked for gender and age specific data, because if not, I'm not sure if the government would have provided it. And in other countries, we're still not having any kind of gender or age sensitive data. So this, for example, just showing that it's not 50 people who are like 17, they're all trained in combat. Next month, they were going to be 18. This is a completely different perception than the majority of them are under 6, so very small children. And the same goes for the population of minors in the camps. Because if we speak about they are minors, what could that be? That could be the 7-year-old or the 1-month-old baby. But the threat perception and the humanitarian perception of that, the responsibility and like a whole of legal humanitarian moral questions are completely different. So that's why it's so important to speak about or to use the right words and to be specific about what kind of profiles are we speaking about. And if we speak more about who would actually come back and how many people and what would be the profiles, that would help. And then another aspect is also that from conversations with people who are working on the ground, who are working with people who have returned with the children in different capacities, they are reintegrating surprisingly well for what they have lived. So we're still waiting for either the attack or the minor who grabs an arm and does something. I mean, there have been incidences in France, and I'm not going to downplay any kind of security risk here. But if we look at what has happened so far, we have had some experience with returnees so far, and it has been much better than anticipated. And in many countries, people working on a practical level say, we are ready. We have so much capacity. We have been looking at this. We have a lot of experience with many of these cases, and we are ready to work with these people. And it's only on a political level that there's hesitation. And same holds true for the prosecution. So coming to the first part of your question, why is it still so difficult? Again, I think it's really a political question, because also prosecutors have told me now in Germany, prosecution of female returnees, there is kind of a process in place. We know how to charge them. We know what evidence we need. We know how the convictions work. It's a fairly working system. It's not perfect, but that's never going to be, because this is not the issue that can be perfect. There's always going to be like this. There's never 100% security, but we are managing. So I think again, it's really decision makers maybe overestimating the actual risk, not wanting to risk their political votes. And now, for example, in France, with elections coming up, any hope of more repatriation are null, even if a more moderate candidate will win. It's a hugely unpopular decision. So I think it's the question, how can we, from a research and practitioner perspective, change the narrative and give decision makers enough arguments to say, well, we are prepared, it's not as bad. And if you want to provide security to your country, well, then repatriation, prosecution, that's the way to go. That's the argument you can make. But there needs to be a bit of, courage. You know, it takes courage to say that and to enact that kind of decision, I'm sure. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I mean, on the issue of foreign ties fighters, I always like to point out that there has been like very longitudinal studies on returnees from Afghanistan, both the ones who came after 1989 and then the ones who left after 2001. And these were 99.9% male, so apparently the most dangerous of all of the individuals, and consistently 8% of them have re-engaged with terrorism. Those 8% were then, of course, responsible for setting up the Al-Qaeda affiliate network around the world, but 92% consistently over decades now have actually not re-engaged with terrorism. So there is a bit of a perception that these are, by definition, all very dangerous individuals, while with the right treatment and the right programs, the majority might actually turn out to be, in the long run, less risky than everyone thinks. We actually got a question via email. This is the first time that happens in our webinars. So thank you so much for that. Have you, and that's, I would say, Gina, you start, and then Sofia, because this is a very broad question. Have you identified promising practices developed over a period of time and evaluated in relation to the rehabilitation of female FDFs in prison within the EU and the UK?
For me, that's not really my area. So I think I'm going to hand that straight over to Sofia, because I haven't looked so much at prison de-radicalization. What I would say, though, is, and this kind of feeds off of what Sofia was saying a second ago, is when you look at prospects for rehabilitation, it's not just dealing with the push or pull factors of an individual going to join IS, of them personally. We also need to look at the structural factors of the communities of origin. That requires actually looking introspectively, looking at ourselves and our own societies. Because when you understand that women on social media have said that they joined because they were feeling like victims of Islamophobia, discrimination, that they wanted to live a certain way of life that was incompatible with their countries or societies of origin. And then now, upon potential repatriation back to those societies of origin, who is expected to change? And is the onus purely on that individual as being, cast as this evil person that couldn't fit the mold? Or do we also need to see that that mold is actually exclusionary and not able to be flexible with some individual's way of living? For example, wearing a hijab or wearing a burqa in France, or another way of living out their goals as not necessarily a female professional, but to be a mother and raising a family, and seeing that as female empowerment. So I think first and foremost, when we look at rehabilitation, we also need to look at our own societies of origin first and see if there is learning and growth that we need to do when we're considering the environment that these individuals return to. But I'll hand it over to Sofia about de-radicalization in prison.
Fantastic. You actually very elegantly answered a question that I didn't post, but it's in the Q&A. So fantastic. Thank you so much.
Amazing.
Yeah, great. I mean, of course, this is still something that is quite new, meaning that if we speak about rehabilitation and integration of any kind of convict, in addition to disengagement de-radicalization processes, these are long processes and they're not linear. That doesn't mean that person like slowly just disengages and then sure he is fine, and what does that mean, and integrated, what does that mean? But it can move forward and backward, as Gina said, many personal factors, community factors, what happens on the world stage can also influence the process and the perception and the identity building of the person. So that's why I think really being able to say how successful the efforts of returnees, male or female, including minors, we will need to have a look in a couple of years. And that's why, again, advocating on many fronts here, but the evaluation and monitoring is a central part of any response to returnees, of rehabilitation, reintegration, and also disengagement efforts. What I can say is that from the experience that has been building up in response to not returnees, but other individuals engaged with violent extremism, is that what seems to work good so far as you can tell, is that in prison itself, it's always good to have a multi-professional approach, so having many different professions coming in, depending on the individual needs. Then another aspect is also to not under or overestimate the role of a religion, for example, because also this like really depends on the profile. But having somebody ready to engage in a really deep religious and ideological a discussion can be very helpful if that for the person was a radicalizing factor. And this is not something that, let's say, I could do but that would be a person that has authority from a religious perspective. So again, who delivers the service and who provides support with disengagement rehabilitation also matters a lot. So like with the profiles of people delivering that kind of programs. And then going to the disengagement reintegration aspects, yeah, a lot like Gina said, I mean, it's very individual, and I think the best running programs that I know are really very individualized. They're really adapting to the person. They are not focusing on quick wins, but see any kind of rehabilitation, disengagement, reintegration process as a marathon. Like it's a long run. You're in it for long term, and you need to accept that people move back and forth. Might be disengaging, that seem to move back. That's why we need like a long-term financing of these structures as well. And then maybe final point also is that what kind of society can we offer them, right? Like what kind of narrative do we as the West or as Germany or as France or as the UK propose? So why should they come back to our society? Why should they, you know, what can we bring to the table as well? And one of the attractions, I mean, this is much more Gina's topic, but from what I understood is that the attraction was also like a very, very nice narrative. Like you can be part of a community, you have certain needs that were not fulfilled in your old life, come to us, we can give you something. So what can we offer? Why should these people come back and adopt our version of society? And again, what does it mean to be socially integrated? Of course, you cannot be violent, you have to abide by laws, but then we enter into this whole discussion, as Gina said, how do I look? You know, like will I be facing the same stigmatization, for example? Will I be able to live my faith? Again, many factors that play into the radicalization, but also disengagement processes. But these are fundamentally social questions that also we as a society and as a political entities, we have to ask ourselves, because if not, we go into the same cycle again, and you know, we never move forward. And I mean, that's again the best argument for repatriation, because how can we go and say you're so inhuman and you kill people and you have like a certain immoral narrative if we are not standing behind the values that we propagate of human rights, of equal treatment, of international law, and so on? And why do we have to wait until international courts oblige our governments to move into the right direction that researchers and experts have been advocating for years? I mean, that's maybe, I will leave that question because that's the fundamental question that I pose myself.
All right. So if you're interested in reintegration issues after terrorist sentences, CEP actually has published a couple of things on this one. One in 2018 was called When Terrorists Come Home, and it looked at the non-existent reintegration programs for terrorist offenders after release in the United States. And we are currently running a couple of pilot programs in prisons in California for the Department of Homeland Security on that one. So there's definitely more to come out. And in 2019, we looked actually at reintegration efforts for released terrorist offenders in Germany. And as you know, Germany being a federal state, there are 16 different versions of how this could be done, and the synergy effects that could be achieved by actually a greater integration between civil society actors and state-led efforts. So security concerns, but also reintegration concerns after the prison release. So, you know, there's quite a few things that you can look up. There is, and I was really glad we made it 60 minutes without mentioning Ukraine, but there is now a question to Ukraine, which I will take. We've been working on this issue of foreign fighters in the Ukraine for a couple of years now at CEP, particularly because the conflict in Ukraine in 2014 and 15 became a favorite conflict to go to for extreme violence-oriented, extreme right-wing individuals from Europe. The majority came from Russia, but also a couple from Europe and the United States. And this is, of course, a concern because in parallel to what happened in Syria on an incredibly larger scale, there was still people going to get actual combat experience, and the ideological motivation for some of these, and you can see the report on our website, was thin. They wanted the actual combat experience, and if you just want the combat experience, you want it not for the conflict, you want it for the time after the conflict. Now, when they returned, and I think this is going to be the same if they return now from this phase of the conflict, and please don't forget, this is an ongoing conflict since 2014, so it's not actually a new conflict, it's just a new stage in an ongoing conflict, was that in difference to people going to Syria and Iraq, they did not join an internationally recognized terrorist organization. So far, neither the Ukraine government nor the Russian government, for that matter, is an internationally recognized terrorist organization. That puts you immediately into a different field of legal linguistics. Then they could have been possibly persecuted as traitors, but they didn't join the Russian or the Ukrainian army, but they joined non-government controlled militias. So that didn't work. You couldn't get them as mercenaries because they weren't paid for what they were doing there. And lastly, you couldn't really get them on misuse of weapons of war in a conflict zone, because Germany or wherever these people came from has no jurisdiction within the Ukraine. So it's not a crime to hold a weapon while you're in the Ukraine. So this is a real problem, I think, when dealing with this. So as you can see, there's quite a number of issues to unpack. What happened? They came back and they basically were interviewed and then became under observation of the security forces in the US as well as in Europe, but you couldn't immediately prosecute them. You couldn't even use the looting paragraph, which Sofia said was used quite successfully in the ISIL case, because they weren't actually not living in private houses, but in the camps of the militia. So it is a big of a challenge on how to deal with these individuals, especially if they were proponing a violent right-wing extremist ideology before they went and after they came back. So that's what I would like to say to this one. There is a lot of information on our website. There's a report on the motivations. There's a webinar on what happens to them now. So the ones that went in 2014, where are they, what they're doing now? And there is a report on the paramilitary training infrastructure in Central and Eastern Europe, including in Ukraine, which was set up as a reaction to the conflict in Ukraine, because pretty much every government in Central and Eastern Europe thought they may be next. And looking at the current situation, that may not be an unlogical thought to have, but that training infrastructure, especially the commercial side of it, is still frequented by radical right-wing extremists from Europe and the US in order to obtain weapons training. And the question always is, for what purpose ultimately? So it is a big problem, and we've been working on it, and I invite you to read through our report. Good. Now, there is also a question, there's also now a question on a term that I'm not familiar with. So how about the risks of minors in and under Islamic indoctrination suffering from neothenia? I have no idea what that is. I hope you know what that means. Do the governments take in consideration the risk that they are potentially ticking bombs? As you had already said, that is the term that is now used, which is maybe not quite the best one to use. Sofia, you want to start? Gina, any ideas?
No, I'm also unfamiliar with that.
Maybe the participant could spell out what neotheny is, and then we can get back to the question. There's also a question on, do we need to develop targeted reintegration programs for adolescent boys if they are repatriated someday? How could these differ compared to other reintegration programs? Sofia, you want to start again, or Gina?
Yeah, I can start, and then Gina, I'm sure you have also some thoughts on that. What I believe from what we know so far on reintegration programs is that, at least, for example, in the European context, and especially also in Germany, which is something I know most about, I think these programs that take care of people returning from Syria and Iraq are already offering very good support. They are people that have been working for years with similar cases. They have specific training. They have access to different additional professions. I mean, it's still ongoing offers. There still can be done more, but there's also more efforts to include mental health expertise, to coordinate with other bodies. You have to be turn coordinators in several departments in Germany. So I think this is also a very good structure to start with. In the case of adolescent boys, of course, there are different challenges coming to the table. But again, they are not, as far as I think, not so far that we need completely new programs. But on the contrary, to provide enough stability to the existing programs who have already experienced with people coming back. And I think then it's just the question of course, there's not going to be coming 100 people back tomorrow, right? So this was also a fear that we would now be overrun by thousands of people coming back, and this is never the case. And even if there's like a political decision that there's going to be a general repatriation, it's still going to be, I think, realistically coming in several stages. So that's why there's a good chance that people in these programs can prepare accordingly. There are efforts to also coordinate with researchers. This is also something that we do now to bring in what Gina has brought in from her research, our research. So this is exactly the kind of effort I think that is also a good start. And we recently did a report for the Radicalization Awareness Network as part of the European Commission, and we found that already for minor returnees, the structures are already there, and we don't need necessarily more training. But what is needed is, for example, one example, more awareness of people working in youth welfare offices to understand what does it mean to be a minor living in a camp for several years, living several years under ISIS, being now on the verge of being an adult, being treated very differently in a legal sense, in political sense, for example, or by security services. So what does that mean? And how can we balance security consideration with child welfare considerations? And I think there are several very delicate questions to be answered, and only if professions from different angles look at the same problem and understand how can we bring out the best for this person who has maybe now an adolescent or becomes an adult, but got into the situation as a child. I think that this is what we need to look at, not bringing out a new program or new approaches, but just best cooperate with the resources that we have already. I think that would be my answer to the question.
Yeah, especially on the prosecution side, it really doesn't matter how old you are when you come in front of the court. The age at the time of the crime is the only determining factor on how prosecutions would proceed. So, it is, as I said, it's a political problem. If they look older, they seem more dangerous, maybe. From a political perspective, legal perspective is actually quite clear. The participant, thankfully, and I think now I know where this is coming from. This seems to be a term from the child soldier space. So the neotheny is a lack of empathy and a growing margin of self and a low margin of self-control with a tendency to be violent. So basically the brutalization experience in a conflict zone or in certain education systems that makes you inherently, I would say, more problematic to reintegrate than you usually would be. So the question was, how do we take this into consideration, that they're going to come back with a particular experience as minors?
I'm happy to jump in on this one. Yep. I think that's already being taken into consideration. In fact, I think that it is the driving consideration when it comes to repatriation or the potential for repatriation of not only adolescent boys, but even younger children. One thing that Sofia was talking about there was the maturation from boyhood to adulthood, and obviously from girlhood to womanhood, that social construction of adulthood that is not replicated within IS. And this is what we need to really drill down into, because when we talk about how boys are militarized from a young age and how girls are expected to take on domestic duties and therefore prepare for marriage and motherhood, we're not talking about 18, we're talking very much younger. For girls, marriage was expected from the age of 9, and this went into the civilian population as well. From my interviews, we had what I could see was a lot of pressure for child and forced marriages from the age of about 11 onwards within local populations. If you look at boys, when they were expected to engage in military training, this could be anything from approximately age 7 or 8 upwards, and there were various different grades and levels. Almost as if you would expect grades at school, there were roughly delineations within the military training camps for boys of different ages. And so this idea of maturation into boyhood, this training started at a very early age. But that was just the physical side. We also need to add in the cognitive side as well of indoctrination. And if you look at how the group structured its state, it was reminders everywhere you go, from billboards to media points to Quranic recitation competitions in public squares to public stonings and executions and amputations in public settings. At all of these points, boys would be expected to at first view and then to participate, whether that is throwing stones at a stoning, whether that is chanting at certain other public events. So it was through this very gradual but very public process in which every boy was immersed in what was a violent society, a militarized society. And what that left boys with was this denigration of mercy, of guilt, of shame, that really encapsulated this full scale and immersive desensitization to violence. And so this is where you know, the child soldiering literature really comes in, because if you look at how young boys were expected to engage with not only enemy combatants, for example, but also their own family members, other friends, classmates, individuals who did not subscribe to IS, they were also expected to excommunicate and sometimes even perpetrate violence against them. So that's kind of how IS has built up this profile and how they have built actually the mentality of these young boys, but in particular boys, under its control. Unfortunately, that's exactly what is being seen by states when it comes to repatriation policies, because it's not now a consideration of how we rehabilitate young children. It's purely on the threat that they pose. And if you think about our judicial system as a whole, the purpose of that judicial system is rehabilitation. It is not crime and punishment for the sake of punishment. The idea behind a justice system, at least in the UK and Germany, etc., is the idea of rehabilitation, the belief in rehabilitation. Unfortunately, the gates have been closed to many of these individuals purely on that expectation that boys in particular have adopted a militarized role. And we can see this play out with those who have and have not been repatriated. The fact that there is still very little attention on these adolescent boys in prison settings is very telling. The fact also, if we look at certain countries who have prioritized the return of orphaned children, so therefore they are no longer in the company of individuals who may pose a risk to continued indoctrination in these camps, and the youngest children. So often, if you see policies, not only, I mean, the UK is not a great example, but other Western and European states, if you look at some of their data where we do actually get age disaggregated data, you'll see that the majority of minors who have been repatriated are those who never would have been born in IS's territory, so the very youngest. And so you get this kind of hierarchy of innocence where really repatriation policies and counterterrorism policies are driven by those who are seen to be more likely to be rehabilitated and reintegrated, and those for whom the door is so far remaining completely closed because they are seen as these desensitized violent actors rather than children who have gone through a process of radicalization and indoctrination in what has been an adult war at the end of the day.